I kind of like movies and books, stories that they basically end with the bad guy getting what is due them, right? I This is awful, but I remember way back, it was probably 1972 or 3 when Dirty Harry was at the theater. And I went with a couple of friends, and there was the one of the final scenes was Harry firing his that 357 Magnum and killing the bad guy. And not the whole theater, but lots of people stood up and cheered when that happened. That's pretty morbid. But there's a part of us, I think, in all of us, that desires what seems right to us, justice, that bad people get what they deserve. The the difficulty in that is it doesn't always happen. In fact, sometimes it can't happen on the time schedule, the timeline that we would like to see it happen in. Peter, and back now to 2 Peter chapter 2, we're back here in the first couple, 3 verses where Peter talks about false teachers, where in verse 2 he says, many will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. In their greed, these teachers will exploit you with fabricated stories. Their condemnation has long been hanging over them, and their destruction has not been sleeping. He does an interesting thing to me where he talks about these false teachers and the fact that they will get what they deserve. There's several things in this for me. One is, I never ever want to be in that category of false teachers. I don't know. I have to be careful because I have lots of crazy ideas, and some of the crazy ideas that people have had over time have been not so crazy after all. Like the earth is round, the earth is not the center of the universe, and stuff like that. But most of my wacky ideas just need to stay out there in the wacky idea box. I want in my life and the stewardship of my work and role and influence, whatever tiny amount there is, that I would deal in the truth. Part of the reason is, excuse me, frankly, I don't want what happens when you don't deal in the truth. There is a destruction. Peter talks about it as a destruction that has not been sleeping. In other words, you might think God and his judgment are like on vacation or taking a nap. They're not. In verse 4, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. This is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desires of the flesh and despise authority. Wow, that's a lot. That's a big lot. God didn't spare the angels when they sinned. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about what happened, we presume, before the beginning of time, or somewhere very near the moments of creation. You know what? I'm not going to argue whether that is 6 literal days and God resting on a literal 7th day, whether that is 6 eons of time, whether that's done by the direct command and intervention, or if it's done through evolution. Honestly, that's the least of our worries when we consider what Peter has written here. What I do know is that a third of the angels sided with Lucifer, who had been like an archangel. There's interesting kind of controversy about where do we get the story of Satan's fall. A lot of people think it's in the book of Isaiah, which I don't particularly think it's not there. The difficulty is Isaiah is also talking in symbolic language about a Babylonian emperor. Well, so what do we do with all that? Well, the key, I think the essence of what Isaiah said about these angels, Satan, Lucifer being the lead head of that whole thing. What the problem was, they decided they didn't want God to be God. Satan's desire has always been that he would be the universal sovereign. He has been at war against God and everything God has willed and desires, maybe not since the beginning, but since, we can say with pretty strong authority, since he was cast out of heaven and these other angels joined him. Okay, there are a couple of quick things here. I'm not going to get into this whole angelology and all of the biggest. I mean, there's a whole field of study about Satan, his origins, and his work. All I'm going to say is Satan is bad. Always has been. Well, maybe not always, but as long as there has been time on earth, Satan has been bad. And he carried a third of the angels with him. He took them, wherever their presence is, there is evil. They represent evil. They are evil in the world. And I do not believe that Satan is just this idea of evil. I think he is a personal being who is evil. Well, one of the things I gather from this is that angels have free will. How else could angels sin? What was the sin? Well, the big sin, I think the biggest, perhaps, I don't know only, but the big sin was to rebel against God. Ultimately, that's what all sin is. All sin is me or you or us, we choosing other than what God's design requires. They sinned. And Peter writes, he sent them to hell. The idea of a literal hell has fallen way out of favor in last 100 years or so. And yet, the Bible talks about hell as though it were a real place. Jesus talked about it as though it were a real place. Where is its location? Couldn't tell you. I do believe it exists. And here Peter works under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit from the concept, the idea that hell is a literal place and it really does exist. The angels who sinned were sent there. And then a little picture of what hell is. They were chained in chains, put in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. It gets a little convoluted here. Put in chains of darkness, held until a time of judgment. So now here's an idea. I don't have the background, and really we don't have time to go deeply into it. But there is a possibility that these angels who fell, who were cast out of heaven along with Lucifer, Satan, and by the way, Satan is several times referred to as an angel of light, that these other angels became a part of his army. Now, a couple of quick things. One is only a third of the angels, but a third of the angels were cast out, leaving 2/3. So you think about the size of the armies, if you want to, and the hosts of heaven really is the terminology that has been translated for us as host of heaven could equally and reliably be translated the armies of heaven. Okay, so you've got 2/3 versus 1/3. God omnipotent, powerful, the ultimate, all-powerful, against Satan, who is powerful but not omnipotent, not all-powerful. God with 2/3, Satan with 1/3. Satan is pretty smart and yet stupid at the same time, believing that he can. Why else would he keep doing what he's doing? He believes that he can win. I suppose there is a possibility that if he understands that he can't win, then he's going to make it as miserable as he can for his enemy. Well, these are things I can't really fully understand, and I probably shouldn't even have brought them into the picture. But the angels who were cast out of him because of sin, not because they had a disagreement with God. That's not what that was about. This was sin, willful, not accidental sin, held for judgment. What will their judgment be? Well, I think it's pretty much the same judgment as every human who decides to go their way and not submit, yield to God's design, to God's will, to God's way. In verse 5, he says, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. You know the story of Noah. The book of Genesis says he was really the only righteous man on earth, the only one who had committed himself to what he understood of God's plan and design, to God's will. Now, bear in mind, at that early stage, there was no law, right? There seems to have been a good bit of direct connection, communication between God and mankind. But Noah, he preached 120 years as he built the ark. No conversions. His family, whether they were converted to his way of believing or just along for the ride, I don't know. I'm going to assume that they accepted his values. They joined him in his walk with God. It was Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives, 8 people. That's all that were left after the flood. And from those 8 people, God recreated humankind. if God didn't spare the rest of the world, why did he not spare them? Because every intention in their thoughts was evil. I mean, that's what Genesis says. They had no thought that was not evil. Wow. Well, my time's up. Couldn't unpack that very well. Today was a little bit of a swing and a miss. We'll pick it up again.